Hello, this is Mr. McLeod, and this video is going to discuss the difference between null and an empty string. So if you look at this sample code here, we've got string A is equal to just quote, quote. Notice it's just a pair of quotes and there's nothing in between. There's not a space. Okay, it's not, if there was a space in between, that wouldn't be empty string, that would be a space character. So if it's an empty string, it literally means there is nothing in the character array that represents the characters in the string, right? The character array is simply an empty array with no characters in it. If you look at the next line, we say string B equals null. So the difference here is that when you have an empty string, it's like you have an object that is a string. It's just that it doesn't say anything, right? It's like empty quotes. So the length is 0, you could say, right? So take note of that. So length is 0. Okay, so A is pointing to this actual object that just has an array of characters that's a length of 0, right? Whereas B, when you assign a variable to the value null, what you're saying is that B is not going to point to anything, right? So notice there's not going to be any arrow pointing to anything because that's what null means. It's not referencing any object. So when you do this first call where we say ends A, then basically you're passing the value you're passing a reference to this empty string to this parameter, right? So let's do it this way. So A is getting passed in here to str, and since A is an empty string, then str in this first call is literally pointing to this same empty string. Okay, let's call this okay, so then this is like what's happening in the ends A call. And this is going to be no problem because right here we can just say str.length. So we call the length method on this empty string and it returns 0, which is not greater than 0. Therefore, this whole statement is false and no problem, we returned false. And so then that's what's going to get printed here. When we make the second call here, let's erase all this. Okay, so when we do the second call, this is passing the variable B. Okay, so it's passing a reference to whatever B is pointing to. str is going to point to that same thing. So if we were to model this, we could say this is ends B. Okay, so that means str is going to point to whatever B is pointing to, which is nothing. So str is not pointing to anything. So you can imagine that if we try to call the length method on str, there's no object that we're calling this on because str is null, right? And that throws a null pointer exception. So this is a runtime exception that happens when you run the program, it will encounter this null pointer exception, which happens whenever you call any method on null. So usually in the AP exam, and it's actually pretty common in a lot of scenarios, you might have a precondition that says this method, a method is only going to work for parameters that are not null. And if you don't have that as a precondition, right, if you're expected to make it work for any value, including null, then you just need to add an extra check at the beginning, usually to handle, what do you do if it's null? So sometimes there's reasonable things to do. You could actually make this one work. So this one appears to be trying to return true if the string that you pass it ends in an A, and false otherwise. So you could make the argument that, okay, if you pass the null, then it's not a string that ends in A, so we should return false. So if you decided that was how you were going to handle it, then right here, you could just add that extra case, right? If str equals null and return false, and that would take care of the null case, right? So that's usually the simplest way to deal with it. Even in methods that do handle null, null is usually like a special case that has to just be handled separately. But whatever you do, if there's any chance that your program is going to call a method on some object that might be null, you should always check that it's not null before calling the method, right? So you could either explicitly check that it's null and then not do it, or if you wanted to check if it's not null. So another way to do this would be, if it's not null, do all this. So we could say if str doesn't equal null, then return all of this, and then just make sure, let's see, after that statement, you just need to finish up with what the default is. So that if str equal null is false, then we want to, that means it is null, then we should just add a little return false here. Okay, so that'd be another way to handle it. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful in understanding how null is different than empty string, what exactly is null, and how do you write code to take it into account. Okay. Next time you get a null pointer exception, you will know exactly what to do. Just find out which object was null, figure out why it might be null, and decide how you're going to handle that, right? So if it's legitimately possible for it to be null and there's a reasonable way to handle it, you can just check if it's null. Otherwise, you might have to redesign your program to guarantee that it's not null. All right, hope you liked this video, and I'll see you in future videos. Goodbye.